Hey, it's Dr. Hannah with this week's Hot Topic. Today I want to talk to you about isolation and self-quarantine. So you're doing everything right to avoid getting coronavirus, like avoiding handshakes, avoiding large gatherings. Of course, you're washing your hands several times a day. A lot of you have been making appointments to get adjusted, but yet you're still worried. So you're worried because you sat next to somebody who was coughing in a movie theater, or your spouse just returned from a business trip. Someone in your office building may have been diagnosed with coronavirus. You went shopping and somebody was coughing a lot. But you can't help to wonder, do I need to self-quarantine? Now, we do need to respect the coronavirus, but you shouldn't fear it. So we'll kind of go through some of this, and then hopefully that'll help you determine a little bit more what to do. So just a quick definition of self-quarantine is when you feel fine and you don't have any symptoms, but you want to separate yourself from others because you think there's a high chance that you've been exposed to the disease. Now, isolation is when you avoid people because you have symptoms of the disease and you don't want to get others sick. So remember, the symptoms have been responded at or reported as like a dry cough, fever, shortness of breath. Those are the main symptoms that people have been diagnosed with it, at least as far as coronavirus. Now, self-quarantine and isolation apply to any disease, but we're talking coronavirus. But basically, the two of them, they look pretty similar, and they have the same end game, which is you basically want to be sequestered from the rest of the public for a period of time, which is typically like 14 days, to prevent the spread of the disease. So you might be asking yourself, well, when should I quarantine myself or isolate yourself? So the CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they recommend that you self-quarantine if you have a medium or high risk of being recently contracted the coronavirus. So a couple of examples of this is if you live with somebody, you're intimate with somebody who's been actually physically diagnosed with the coronavirus, and you have taken zero precautions to protect yourself. Another example is when you're traveling to certain epicenters, but again, the U.S. has banned travel, so most of that you should be okay, and that really shouldn't apply to you. So in those cases, experts recommend that you stay away from others, again, like I said, for 14 days to see if any of these symptoms develop. So if you're feeling sick, like you get a sore throat, a fever, or even just a cold, you should probably just stay home and play it safe. So remember, self-quarantine is when you don't have symptoms, you're trying to be proactive, and isolation is when you do have some symptoms. So when self-quarantine unnecessary, so that's kind of the, do I do this or do I do that? Now, if you're healthy and you don't fall into that high or medium risk categories, you really don't need to self-quarantine. So pretty much in general, if you feel okay, you don't have any symptoms, you don't need to stay home. But if you're feeling a little sick, you should stay home. So just kind of think of it just like the typical flu, even though this is not the flu, but just monitor yourself for symptoms, and then you should self-isolate yourself if they do develop. But don't panic if you live with somebody who has flu-like symptoms. If somebody in your office has been diagnosed with coronavirus, you went to a conference where somebody was diagnosed, or you flew on a plane that somebody was diagnosed with, unless there is that asterisk in there, unless you were within 2 seats of each other that were diagnosed with each other, then you definitely should self-quarantine yourself. But again, those are kind of things of reasons why you shouldn't necessarily have to self-quarantine or isolate yourself. So like I said, how long should you self-quarantine yourself is typically what the CDC recommends is at least 14 days. And this is pretty much just to see if any symptoms are going to develop. You're going to notice symptoms between like 2 and 6 days, and then you should be okay by the end of the 2 weeks. So you want to be asymptomatic for a full 2 weeks to be safe before you go back out into public. So the other thing is, what should you do if you do get isolated or you self-quarantine yourself? You definitely should tell your healthcare provider, whether it's your medical doctor, your chiropractor. I would love to know if you are self-quarantined, really because we can give you some health tips to make you feel better, either whether you've had anxiety about it or you just want to boost your immune system. There are a couple tips that we can do. And then same thing, we can tell you if there's some red flags, like, hey, if you're noticing like severe distress where you can't catch your breath, then of course we would tell you to go to the emergency room. Some of those things. So definitely let a healthcare provider know if you have self-quarantined yourself or isolated yourself. So the other big thing is, what can you do with people that you live with if you are diagnosed with it? So if you don't have to self-quarantine, you should have, or I'm sorry, if you do have to self-quarantine yourself, you should have as little contact with others that you live with as possible. So ideally you would stay in like a private room. You would stay in like a master bedroom where it has the bathroom, your own bathroom, you don't share with anybody else. And then you're kind of secluded from the rest of the household. However, that's probably not realistic. So if you are going to be out and about with other people in your house that are not self-quarantined, you, as the person who has the symptoms, should wear a mask. It's not necessary for other people in the family to wear a mask if they're not sick. So this applies to anything. If you're not sick, do not wear a mask. You should save those masks only for healthcare providers. The other thing, what does it look like when you're self-quarantined? Like, can I order my groceries and open the door from the delivery person? Can I take my dog for a walk? Absolutely. You can totally do that. It's really just those like major face-to-face contacts that you have with people, like a 2-hour meeting, something like that, that you're spending a lot of time with somebody else, that you have that tendency to spread the virus. So if you are self-quarantined or isolated, go for a walk, go get some sunlight. Some vitamin D is really good for you. Don't feel like you can't say hi to your neighbors if you are self-quarantined. But it's the short-term contact that you might have. It's not a big deal. But it's really that long-term, like face-to-face contact that you have to be concerned about if you're self-quarantined. So those are basically the difference, some kind of tips if you are, whether you decide you want to be self-quarantined or isolated. And really, if you have any questions, please let me know. I will give you my honest, my professional opinion. When in doubt, it is safe to just say, hey, I want to be self-quarantined because I want to prevent this from spreading to other people. And again, if you are feeling sick, just don't go out. This will pass, but it's best just to be safe now. But again, wash your hands. I said this before, wash your hands, drink lots of water, boost your immune system with healthy, good foods, not sugary foods. Chiropractic care is also going to boost your immune system, and just have really good hygiene. So that's all I have for you guys today. Again, our special VIP page that we have for Touch of Wellness community, or Touch of Wellness VIP community, we are making that into like a coronavirus hub, so you can get all that information. If you need that link to join it, you let me know. I'll even have Mary post this down below. But that way you can have as much contact about the coronavirus as possible. Contact us if you have any questions or anything. And then we'll get through this together. All right, guys, that's all I have for you guys this week. We'll see you guys next time.